Welcome to the CRRC Podcast. All too often, we assume Georgia is a deeply conservative country. Politicians talk about traditional values, international observers point to conservative trends, and many Georgians describe their country in the same way. But what if I told you that according to our recent report by researcher Givi Silagadze, Georgian society is, in actuality, more split down the middle, and that this misunderstanding has major implications on Georgian politics and even its democratic future? Today, I'm walking you through our groundbreaking study on Georgian social conservatism, research that challenges what we think we know about Georgian political attitudes. Let me share some data from a recent study that might surprise you. In October 2023, we surveyed about 1,200 Georgians to measure social conservatism. To clarify, social conservatism distinguishes itself from economic conservatism as a set of ideological beliefs that pose themselves as a defense of traditional values. So think of values like nationalism, enforcing traditional gender roles, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, and a heavy sense of nostalgia for the past. To measure this form of conservatism, we created an index or scale of 4 questions. Those who disagreed with all of the questions received a score of 0, meaning not conservative, while those that agreed with all the questions received a score of 1, meaning highly conservative. The result? Georgians on average received a score of 0.51, so right about in the middle. So let me then break down what these 4 key questions were, which we use to define Georgian conservatism. First, national pride. Are there other countries better than Georgia? Exactly 50% said yes, and 50% said no, so a perfect split. Second, traditional gender roles. Should a wife be obedient to her husband? Only 37% agreed. That means nearly 2/3 of Georgians reject this traditional value. Third, Soviet nostalgia. Was the Soviet period better because Georgians were, quote, properly respected? 43% agreed, 46% disagreed. Again, almost perfectly divided. Only the 4th question on LGBTQ plus rights was there not an even split. So are LGBT people already protected enough in Georgia? 52%, so a slight majority, said yes, while 32% said no. Despite this slight majority agreeing to the last question, it's clear that Georgian society is not as conservative as some may think. In reality, many in society engage with these key questions in surprising ways. So if Georgia isn't overwhelmingly conservative, who are the conservatives? Our data paints a very specific picture. Picture an older man living outside Tbilisi with a high school education who supports Georgian Dream and attends church weekly. That's your typical Georgian conservative according to our research. But let me put some numbers on this. The generational gap is massive. Our analysis shows a 28-point difference between 80-year-olds and 20-year-olds on the conservatism scale. Think about that. A Georgian in their 80s is almost 30 percentage points more conservative than someone in their 20s. The political divide is even starker. Georgian Dream supporters score 18 points higher on conservatism than opposition supporters. So that's not just a preference, it's a fundamentally different worldview. Geography matters too. People living in villages score 6 points higher than Tbilisi residents, and education creates another divide. Those with only a secondary education score 8 points higher than university graduates. Gender plays a role as well. Men score 7 points higher than women on our conservatism scale. Now here's what's crucial to understand. These aren't small differences. They represent completely different ways of seeing Georgia's place in the world, the role of government, and what kind of society Georgia should become. Here's where things get really interesting and perhaps surprising. You'd expect people who feel strongly about traditional values to be highly engaged in politics, right? Wrong. Our data shows exactly the opposite. Social conservatives are 18 percentage points less likely to attend rallies, sign petitions, or contact government officials. Let me repeat that. The people who feel strongest about traditional values are significantly less likely to participate in democratic processes. But their online presence is a different story. They post about politics on social media at the same rate as everyone else. What does this tell us about political engagement in Georgia? It suggests that voices in traditional and physical political spaces, so rallies, demonstrations, civic organizations, are not conservative ones. It is clear that the ruling party benefits from this dynamic. Conservative voters may not show up to rallies, for example, but they do show up to vote and are some of the loudest voices online and in media. Perhaps the most alarming finding from our research might be this. When forced to choose between democracy and stability, conservatives increasingly choose stability. We ask the simple but profound question. If a government maintains peace and stability in a country, does it matter whether it's democratic or not? Highly conservative Georgians are 33 percentage points more likely to say no. It doesn't matter if the government is democratic as long as it maintains order. Now let me put this into context. We've seen this story before in other countries of the former Soviet Union and Soviet bloc. Hungary's Viktor Orban, for example, built his entire political strategy around this trade-off. Vladimir Putin's approval ratings in Russia have long been tied to perceptions of stability rather than democratic legitimacy. And here in Georgia, in its most recent parliamentary election, a key strategy of Georgian Dream was positioning themselves as the only party capable of ensuring stability and peace with Russia, even despite their government embracing authoritarian-style rule. The pattern is clear. When people feel uncertainty or instability, they become willing to trade democratic rights for the promise of order. And in Georgia, conservatives are already predisposed to make that trade. Ultimately, this isn't just about political preferences, it's about the future of Georgian democracy itself. Because democracy requires more than just elections. It requires a population that values democratic processes even when they're messy, slow, or produce outcomes they don't like. If a significant portion of the population is willing to abandon democracy for stability, that creates an opening for authoritarian leaders who promise order above all else. How do outlooks on stability and democracy impact the public's view of EU relations and the country's EU aspirations? Yes, social conservatives are more skeptical of EU integration. But here's what's interesting. Even among the most conservative Georgians, fewer than 25% feel outright negatively towards the EU. However, on the other hand, here's where our findings are concerning. Among conservatives, 20% are more likely to support ties with Russia. Although this is a small group, it's still a meaningful constituency that sees Russia as a viable alternative to European integration. The real challenge isn't that conservatives hate the EU necessarily. It's that they're susceptible to right-wing talking points that demonize advancements to human rights and democratic processes. However, the opportunity here is that according to these findings, many social conservatives do not equate the EU to the promotion of civil liberties and rights that they would prefer to dismantle. In other words, their conservatism exists outside of a traditional polarized framework equating the EU to social progressivism and Russia, as one example, as a safeguard for traditional values. So what do we do with this information? Well, most importantly, this data can be used to inform public discourse and policy decisions. First, opposition parties are missing a huge opportunity. There's a substantial group of voters labeled as conservative who are politically disengaged and in actuality not ideologically committed to the ruling party. These voters could be mobilized, but only if opposition parties can address their concerns about stability, tradition, and national pride. The question is, can they do this in a way that does not run counter to EU accession or limit the freedoms of already marginalized communities? This research also reveals that a major driving force for the ruling party's popularity are promises of stability, even at the price of democratic processes. In other words, although they promote values considered socially conservative, anti-EU sentiment is not as strongly upheld by those that identify as socially conservative in Georgia. Here's the bottom line from our research. Georgia's future won't be decided by a conservative majority because that majority doesn't exist. The finding that social conservatives are most likely to prefer stability over democratic processes also informs Georgia's current political context, where the ruling party is embracing authoritarian-style rule in the name of peace and stability. Our data shows us that Georgian society is far more complex and divided than anyone assumed. Understanding that complexity isn't just academically interesting, it's essential for anyone who cares about Georgia's democratic future. That's all for this episode. You can find the full report and additional resources on our website, crrc.ge. Until next time.